caught my brother's fiancée cheating, but nobody believed me. I got cut off, and years later, they only reached out because they needed me to testify about the affair during his divorce. About 3 years ago, I, 30M, tried to convince my brother, Ethan, 35M, to call off his wedding. I had uncovered proof that his fiancée, Jessica, 33F, was cheating on him. But instead of listening to me, the entire family brushed me off. They went ahead with the wedding, and to make matters worse, they accused me of being jealous and unable to handle Ethan's happiness. They even went as far as cutting me out of their lives entirely. From that moment on, I've had zero contact with my family. They never reached out to me, and I didn't see a reason to reach out to them either. Then, just a few days ago, they showed up out of the blue. It turns out Ethan is now getting divorced, and they suddenly want my help. Apparently, they need me to testify about Jessica's infidelity because Ethan is fighting against paying child support. I refused, flat out. I told them I wouldn't be testifying, and now I'm being painted as heartless and selfish. Part of me feels satisfied saying no. Like this is the closure I've been waiting for all these years. But I can't deny there's a voice in the back of my head, fueled by what some of my friends have said, wondering if I'll regret this. They've told me this might be my one chance to reconcile with my family, and if I let it pass, I might never get another opportunity. So now I'm stuck wondering, am I doing the right thing? Or am I letting my hurt and anger cloud my judgment? I'm really torn about what to do. What if I decide not to testify in family court for my brother? For those who are curious, here's the full story. My brother, who I'll call Mickey, got engaged to his fiancée, let's call her Nora, after they'd been together for 2 years. Mickey and I were never particularly close, even as kids. We had this intense sibling rivalry growing up, and it carried into adulthood. Whether I meant to or not, I always felt like I was in some kind of competition with him. The worst part? Our parents didn't do much to discourage it. In fact, they seemed to encourage it at times. They clearly knew I had issues with Mickey. I couldn't help resenting how much better they treated him just because he was more successful than I was. Looking back, I realize I was pretty naive. I believed family should be above judging you based on how well you're doing in life. I thought they'd be impartial, especially when it came to their kids. But I've since learned that's a fairy tale. People judge you based on your success no matter who they are, and family is no exception. At the time, though, I didn't understand that. I also didn't know how to handle things tactfully. I just blurted out whatever came to mind, even when it probably wasn't the smartest thing to say. That's just how I was back then. I'd say whatever popped into my head. It's probably why my parents had no trouble figuring out that I'd always resented my brother. As much as I hate to admit it, Mickey really was better than me at certain things. Unfortunately, those particular things just happened to be the ones my parents cared most about. Mickey was great at math and science, and ended up landing a job at a growing tech company right out of college. He started earning serious money, even though he was much younger than most of his colleagues. Honestly, it wasn't shocking. He was smart and hardworking. Over time, his career kept climbing higher and higher. Meanwhile, I was struggling to find my footing. I'd chosen to study literature and dreamed of becoming a writer. But things didn't go as planned. I ended up dropping out in my second year of college after realizing I probably wasn't as talented as I'd been led to believe. Growing up, writing had been the one thing that made me stand out. I was average at most subjects, but writing was where I excelled. I'd won competitions and been praised for my talent, which gave me something to feel proud of. It was the one way I could compete with Mickey, his medals for science fairs versus my awards for writing. But once I dropped out, that sense of accomplishment disappeared. I tried to make it on my own after leaving school, dabbling in different things to figure out what I could do with my life. I ended up working as a freelance copywriter, but the income was barely enough to scrape by. Meanwhile, Mickey was thriving. He'd reached a point where he was doing so well financially that he even started paying back our parents for everything they'd done for him. Naturally, the comparisons were inevitable. Every time the family got together, my parents couldn't resist reminding me that I needed to take my life more seriously. They'd go on and on about how I should find a more respectable job. And without fail, every lecture about my life ended with them holding up Mickey as an example. Take a page out of his book, they'd say, or something equally frustrating. Most of the time, I couldn't hold back my frustration, and the conversation would spiral into a shouting match. I'd accuse them of being terrible parents for constantly comparing me to Mickey when there was no need. I told them over and over how sick I was of this dynamic. It had been the same since I was a kid. It always followed the same pattern. We'd fight, go silent for a few weeks, and then they'd reach out to reconcile. Things would settle down for a while until the cycle started all over again. Then Mickey got engaged to his girlfriend of 2 years. I'd met her a few times when she came around to visit the family while they were dating. She seemed nice enough, and during their engagement, she came across as a good match for him. At first, everything seemed fine. Mickey's fiancée seemed like a decent person, maybe even a great match for him. But about 2 weeks before the wedding, everything changed. My family threw a dinner party at our house to celebrate, and even though Mickey and I don't exactly get along, we'd always made an effort to stay civil for the sake of appearances. I'd been involved in all the pre-wedding events, but to be honest, my heart wasn't in it. At one point during the party, I decided to step outside for a smoke, a decision I still regret. That's when I saw Nora making out with one of our younger cousins, Jacob, 27M. Back then, my parents didn't know I smoked, so I had to walk a little ways from the house to avoid being caught. When I saw Jacob's car parked nearby, I was confused. He'd mentioned earlier that he was leaving to head home. Curious, I decided to take a closer look to see what was going on. That's when I caught them. Nora and Jacob were in his car, completely wrapped up in each other. I don't know who was more shocked, me, them, or maybe all three of us equally. I immediately stubbed out my cigarette and turned back toward the house, refusing to look back. When I got inside, Nora returned a few minutes later, acting like nothing had happened. Jacob was nowhere to be seen. I assume he finally left for real this time. Luckily, everyone else at the party had been drinking and didn't seem to notice that the three of us were missing for a while. No one asked any questions about it. That night, I didn't say a word to Mickey. For one thing, I hadn't fully processed what I'd just seen. For another, I didn't know how to even begin that conversation. I hadn't even begun to process what I'd seen. Everything felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's drama. I ended up leaving the party soon after and headed home, trying to wrap my head around it all. That night, Nora wouldn't stop messaging me. She begged me not to say anything to Mickey about what I'd seen. She claimed it had been a one-time mistake, swearing up and down that she'd only kissed Jacob that night and nothing more. She told me she deeply regretted it, promised it would never happen again, and pleaded with me not to ruin her marriage. According to her, she was fully committed to Mickey and just needed me to keep her secret. I spent the rest of the night thinking about everything, trying to figure out what the right thing to do was. Ultimately, I decided that I couldn't keep this from Mickey. Even though we weren't exactly close, he was still my brother, and he deserved to know the truth. The next day, I asked him to meet me for lunch. When we sat down, I told him everything, exactly what I'd seen and what Nora had been messaging me about. He didn't say much at first. He just looked completely blindsided and hurt. After a long pause, he finally thanked me for being honest with him, then left to head home. I wasn't sure what kind of response I expected, but I was still surprised when a few days passed and nobody from the family reached out to me. Then, things took a stranger turn. I realized everyone in the family had blocked me, on social media, on their phones, everywhere. And all of this happened about a week before the wedding. As the wedding approached, I had no idea what was happening. Nobody was talking to me, and I couldn't figure out why. Desperate for answers, I decided to visit my parents. But when I got there, they wouldn't even open the door. With no other option, I went to see Mickey, convinced he had something to do with all of this. He did open the door, but only to hurl insults at me. The moment he saw me standing there, his expression twisted into one of pure disdain. I was completely taken aback. The last time we talked, he'd thanked me for being honest and telling him the truth about Nora. But now, it was like he was a completely different person. Mickey accused me of trying to sabotage his relationship out of spite. He said I was just a miserable person who couldn't stand to see him happy, and that's why I had made up this awful story about Nora and Jacob. Hearing those words from him stung more than I can describe. It was obvious to me that Nora must have convinced him I was lying. I wanted to defend myself, to set the record straight, but I could see there was no point. Mickey wasn't going to listen. So I turned and walked away, feeling more defeated than ever. Later that day, I got a message from my parents. They had unblocked me, but only to tell me not to contact them again. They accused me of being a jealous liar who was trying to ruin Mickey's life and marriage simply because my own life wasn't going well. It was like they had all decided to believe this completely fabricated version of me. They accused me of being bitter and envious of Mickey's success, claiming I had always resented him. My parents said they knew I was capable of going to great lengths to sabotage his happiness, including fabricating awful lies about his fiancée. According to them, my goal was to ruin their wedding out of pure spite. They told me I was disgusting and that they didn't want anything to do with me anymore. It was clear that Nora had spun her story well enough to convince them she was the victim, and they chose to believe her over their own son. There wasn't much I could say to that. I knew they wouldn't listen. For the next 5 years, I had no contact with my parents, Mickey, or anyone else in the family. To them, I was just the jealous brother who tried to destroy Mickey's marriage because I couldn't handle my own insecurities. I realized there was no way to change the image they had of me, so I stopped trying. I let it go. At first, those years were incredibly hard. I was deeply hurt by the way things had played out and struggled with depression early on. But over time, I started to heal. I focused on my work, and gradually, things began to improve. Now, I'm doing pretty well for myself. After years of building my career as a copywriter, I've made a name for myself in the industry. My income is much better, and I'm content with the life I've created. Honestly, I don't even miss my family anymore. I don't miss my family much anymore because I've come to realize how toxic they were to me. So when they showed up at my house recently, asking me to help by testifying for Mickey in family court, I didn't hesitate to refuse. After everything they said and did to me over the years, I don't feel like I owe them anything. As I mentioned earlier, some of my friends think I'll regret this decision. They believe I should at least try to talk things out with my parents and Mickey to clear the air instead of holding on to my anger. Meanwhile, my family hasn't held back in trying to make me feel guilty about refusing to help. I've been getting a flood of messages and emails, accusing me of being heartless and selfish. They've even justified their actions from back then, saying they had their reasons for believing Nora over me. As much as it stings, I can understand their perspective, at least a little. Like I mentioned earlier, I did have a tendency to lash out at my parents whenever they compared me to Mickey. They probably assumed I really did hate and resent him. So, when Nora told them I was making up lies to sabotage his life, it made sense that they believed her. I'm not saying my parents were right, but I know the way I reacted to their constant comparisons didn't help. I said things in those fights that weren't exactly kind, and I didn't put much effort into defending myself when the family turned on me. Instead, I just walked away and let it all go. So it's not surprising they didn't reach out to me for 5 years. They thought I was lying the whole time, at least, until they found out about Nora's affairs. This is part of the reason I feel so conflicted now. Deep down, I think things could have been resolved if we'd all made an effort to fix things back then. But none of us did. And I know I share the blame for that. What's making it harder is what my friends said about this being my one shot at mending things with my family. Sure, a lot of people claim they can live without their family, especially when that family is as toxic as mine. But I can't shake the feeling that I might be making a huge mistake here. So I really need to know. Am I the asshole for refusing to help my brother by testifying for him in court? I've thought long and hard about this situation, and I've made my decision. I'm not going to testify for Mickey. I don't need to. I also don't feel the need to repair my relationship with my family. For the past 5 years, I've managed just fine without them, and I'm pretty sure they've gotten along just fine without me too. The only reason they've reached out now is because of Mickey's divorce and the whole child support issue. Mickey and Nora have been going through the divorce process for a couple of months. So, it's not like they just found out I was telling the truth about Nora back then. They've known for months, but didn't think it was worth reaching out to me until they needed something. Mickey apparently caught Nora texting Jacob a few months ago, which is how he discovered the affair. Nora claims it's only been going on for about a year and blames it on feeling neglected because Mickey was too focused on work. Then, things took an even messier turn. A couple of weeks ago, they had a court-ordered paternity test done on their 1-year-old son. Turns out, the child isn't Mickey's. Now, Mickey has refused to pay child support after the divorce. But Nora insists he should continue supporting the child financially because he's been acting as the father for the past year, not Jacob. This is where I come in. Mickey and my parents want me to testify that Nora's affair with Jacob actually started long before their marriage. They think this will help Mickey avoid paying child support by proving that Jacob is the biological father and has had contact with both Nora and the child. It's a complicated mess, but here's the bottom line. Mickey and my parents have known about Nora's affair for months now. They knew I was telling the truth all along, yet they still didn't bother to contact me until they needed my help. That's what's been sitting with me as I've thought this over. And the more I've reflected on it, the clearer it's become. I don't owe them anything. I'm done with them. Just as I've stayed away from them for the past 5 years, I can't continue to keep my distance. I haven't replied to any of their desperate messages or emails, and honestly, I don't feel the need to. However, I've talked to my friends about this since they were the ones encouraging me to reach out to my family and try to reconcile. My friends only wanted the best for me. They didn't want me to look back on this decision with regret. I appreciated that, so I felt like I owed it to them to discuss everything. When I told them I decided not to testify for Mickey, I could tell they weren't entirely on board. Even though I didn't owe anyone an explanation, I decided to give one anyway. My friends had been by my side through thick and thin over the past 5 years, ever since my falling out with my family. I'm incredibly grateful for their support, so I felt they deserved to understand the full picture. I told them more than I ever had before about my family, how toxic they were and how they had treated me. They already had a general idea of what I'd been through, but this time, I laid everything out in detail. It wasn't easy. Reliving all those memories felt deeply personal and painful, but I knew they needed to hear it to fully understand why I'd made my choice. I talked about the insults, the accusations, and the way my family turned on me when I told them the truth about Nora. Then I explained how, after all this time, the only reason they were reaching out to me now was because they needed something. They didn't value me as a person back then, and they don't now. If they did, they would have apologized months ago when they realized I'd been telling the truth. Instead, they got defensive, tried to justify their actions, and made it clear they didn't actually care about what I'd gone through. For a moment, they almost had me reconsidering. I started thinking about their point of view, but the more I reflected, the clearer it became. They should have believed their son over Nora. They didn't. That decision had consequences, and now they were paying for it. I warned Mickey and my parents about Nora, but they didn't listen. They insulted me, dismissed me, and cut me out of their lives. It would be wrong for me to reopen that wound by going back to them now. I refuse to put myself in a position where I'll get hurt again. That's why I'm choosing to stay away. After I opened up and shared everything, my friends fully understood my choice. They told me they'd support me no matter what, and now that they know the whole story, they agree I made the right decision for myself. That reassurance means everything to me, and it's a huge relief to know my friends are in my corner. Update 2. It's been 2 weeks since my family first showed up at my house, trying to convince me to help them. Since I ignored all their messages and emails, they decided to reach out again today. It was the weekend, and I was at home relaxing when that afternoon, my doorbell started ringing nonstop. I looked outside, and of course, it was my family. I decided right then to act like I wasn't home. I ignored the doorbell for a few minutes, hoping they'd get the hint and leave. But instead, my dad started yelling, saying he knew I was inside and that I needed to talk to them. I have no idea how he figured it out, but he kept shouting from outside, demanding that I open the door. I stayed quiet, but the yelling didn't stop. After a while, my dad and Mickey started pushing against the door like they were trying to force their way in. I could hear the strain in the doorframe and started to worry they might actually break it down. At that point, I felt like I had no choice but to open the door. By the time I got up, I was already pretty irritated. I'd made it crystal clear that I wanted to be left alone. The last thing I wanted was to deal with calling the cops, especially since I live in a nice, quiet neighborhood. Besides, the whole ordeal would have been more trouble than it was worth. So, I opened the door, and before they could even start, I told them straight up that I wasn't going to help. I made it clear that my mind was made up and that nothing they said would change that. It wasn't even about holding a grudge anymore. I just wanted to stay away from them. I told them they needed to respect my decision because showing up at my house and trying to strong-arm me into helping wasn't going to work. If anything, their stunt was only making me angrier. My parents stayed silent for a moment, but Mickey spoke up. He said he really needed my help because he didn't think it was fair for him to pay child support for a child that wasn't his. He tried to guilt me, saying that if I could help him, I should because we're family. At that, I couldn't help but laugh. Family? For the past 5 years, we've been anything but family. Now, just because they needed something, I was suddenly supposed to play the role of the dutiful brother? I told him, very bluntly, that they couldn't just decide we were family when it was convenient for them. I also made it clear that I no longer considered them family. Then I told them to get out of my sight. Apparently, my tone didn't sit well with my parents. My dad immediately started yelling, and my mom chimed in, telling me I had no right to speak to them that way. She said they were still my parents and had raised me, so I owed them everything. Naturally, I fought back. Within minutes, the whole thing devolved into yet another shouting match. If Mickey hadn't stepped in, we probably would have been screaming at each other all night. Mickey finally got them to calm down, but then he turned to me and started pleading. He said he knew he hadn't been the best brother, but he'd owe me big time if I helped him this once. He went on about how he never even wanted kids and how unfair it was for him to have to financially support both his cheating wife and a child that wasn't his. He laid it on thick, calling the situation a massive injustice and saying I was the only one who could stop it. It all sounded very dramatic, but I could tell he was desperate and genuinely counting on me. At that moment, though, I'd had enough. After the argument with my parents, I had zero interest in helping any of them. I told them to leave or I'd call the cops. Then I shut the door in their faces. Eventually, they left. I don't know if I made the right call, but I just hope they finally leave me alone after this. I genuinely have nothing more to say to them. I do feel bad for Mickey, though. If our parents had been better, more supportive and less toxic, I think we could have had a completely different relationship. Not that Mickey is perfect or blameless in all of this, but I can't help feeling a little sorry for the mess he's in now. If he had just listened to me back when I first warned him about Nora, all of this could have been avoided. Even now, I think a lot of the blame falls on our parents. Their awful behavior poisoned everything, and they made it impossible for me to even consider helping Mickey. Without their interference, he might have been able to convince me to step in. But what's done is done. While I won't be helping Mickey, I do genuinely hope he can avoid paying child support. From a moral standpoint, it's infuriating to think that Nora might get away with this and force him to financially support a child that isn't his. She doesn't deserve it. She's the worst of them all. I detest her even more than I dislike my parents, which says a lot. Ethically, it's just not right for Mickey to be stuck paying for her mistakes. I stand by my decision not to get involved, but I do hope things work out in his favor. Update 3. It's been 3 months since my last update. I know I haven't been active here, but honestly, nothing significant has happened worth sharing. My parents have tried reaching out to me several times during this time. Unfortunately, instead of apologizing, their emails have been full of guilt trips and shame. They kept telling me I was making a huge mistake by refusing to help Mickey, even going so far as to say they were ashamed to call me their son. It was exhausting, and as if that approach would ever make me want to help. The tone of their messages was consistently condescending and insulting, and after a while, I stopped bothering to read them. It's not like I tried blocking my parents several times, but they just create new accounts to keep bothering me. It was annoying, but I didn't particularly care. Ignoring them became second nature, and eventually, I got so busy with work that I barely thought about any of it. The only updates I got about my parents or Mickey's custody case came from my cousin. Her mom is still close to my parents, but my cousin and I have always gotten along, so she's been filling me in. Last week, she told me that Mickey won't have to pay child support after all. After a lot of back and forth, Jacob finally agreed to step up and be a father to his son. Apparently, he wasn't ready to commit at first, but Nora made it clear that if he didn't, she'd leave him. It turns out Jacob had been in contact with Nora all along and had met his biological son several times, just as Mickey had suspected. He wasn't entirely absent from the child's life. He just didn't want to take on the responsibility. but I guess the thought of losing Nora scared him enough to agree to her terms. From what I hear, they're planning to get married as soon as Nora and Mickey's divorce is finalized. They're rushing the process and have even started agreeing to all of Mickey's terms to speed things up. Honestly, I doubt things will end well for Nora. Relationships built on ultimatums rarely do. But that's her karma to deal with, and I couldn't care less. What does matter to me is that Mickey is finally getting out of this mess. I hope that someday, he and I can reconcile. But as long as our parents are in the picture, I don't think they'll let that happen. In the end, it doesn't matter much. I'm happy with my life, and I've reached a point where these things don't affect me anymore.